Hello and welcome to episode 319 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. My name is Mark, I am the Green Tank, and I am joined by Neelan the Orange Tank.
Hello.
And no other tanks. Another twofer, yes. We are Kellenless yet again, but we'll try to make it through. And we're going to try to make it through actually with the help of you all, because for this episode, we are going to dig into our treasure trove of topic recommendations, which you can make at boardgamebarrage.com/topics, where listeners are welcome to suggest topics for the show or things they want to hear us talk about. Today's episode was suggested by user Gobbledygook. Is it Let's
go with that.
Yeah, Gobbledygook. You know who you are, Gobbledygook. Anyhow, the question is, what are your exceptions that prove the rule? Or, to put it another way, are there any games that you really like that are in genres you typically don't enjoy? For example, I vastly prefer playing highly interactive games with a shared central area where you're very much playing against the other players and not the game systems. That said, I really love playing Cascadia with my friends, particularly when we're in the mood for something relaxed, and even though it embodies many of the issues I have with modern Euros. So that's a interesting question, so we'll dive into that later. But before we do that, we'll be talking about the games we have been recently playing. Neelan will start us off talking about Andromeda's Edge, and I will follow it up with Karvi. But before we go into that, Neelan, I know we were talking about this earlier, but in addition to losing Kellen for this episode, I almost lost me. I just had a traumatic experience I think a lot of people have had out there. Thought I lost my wallet. I won't belabor the story. I ended up driving all around town, checking every place that I've been to, ended up being kicked underneath a table in the house.
And right before the start of record, too.
Literally
awful timing.
Yeah, and it was making me think back, because I haven't lost my wallet very often, and it made me remember that part of the reason that I hadn't is I used to, and I don't know if you ever remember me doing this, I used to attach my wallet with one of those retractable lanyards.
Like one of those slinky type things?
Yeah, so what I would do is I would just go to a Staples or whatever and get a pack of these retractable lanyards.
Oh,
and
right.
I just attach it to my wallet, and I would just always clip that to my pants wherever I went. And I think I did that for a long time. I think Roselle told me that I was being a child or something like that. Or maybe realized it was pretty silly that I would cut a hole in my wallet to attach this retractable lanyard, and I stopped doing that.
You would actually cut a hole in the wallet to attach it? That's nuts.
Yeah, to slip the lanyard.
Yeah.
But my near loss of it now is making me think I go back to those retractable lanyard days. But anyway. Okay, so Neelan, with that aside, why don't you tell us about Andromeda's Edge?
Yeah, so Andromeda's Edge is the spiritual successor to Dwellings of Eldervale, and I don't know how much you remember about us talking about this. I went back and listened to that review, which was actually another episode, but that was just a twofer between the two of us. So You were wrapped with attention as I was telling you about Dwellings of Eldervale without Kellen.
As I always am.
Absolutely. I guess it probably behooves the listener more to talk about Andromeda's Edge specifically than, expecting them to remember anything that I said about Dwellings of Eldervale. So let's just dive into the high level talk of what this is here. This is a worker placement, Ameritrashi sort of hybrid. So you have a hex board that represents the map, and this is set in space. So each of these spaces on this hex map represent planets and stations and stuff like that. You have a number of spaceships, which are your workers. Every turn, you're going to put out one of those workers onto the board in what is effectively a worker placement type system. So you put it on the board, you do the action of the space, most of the time you're done. Okay? But every subsequent worker you place after that first one has to be adjacent to one you placed previously. And from that point on, you're also allowed to enter a hex that another person is occupied in. So you then take the action of that space, but now you're also fighting. Okay? Once the combat resolves, only one person's left in that space. So the game is kind of this constant jockeying for position on the board in order to establish, effectively your ability to do worker placement actions, because from that point on, you're always placing adjacent. So if someone comes in, fights you out of a zone, you can't then place adjacent to that piece on a future turn. So that's the way that the combat sort of intersects with the worker placement system here. All of this in service of collecting resources, upgrading your ships, advancing up of these tracks for sort of end game scoring, all that sort of thing. There's one other little twist to the gameplay in this, where once all your workers are on the board, your only option on that turn is to pull them all back, activating some modules that you're acquiring along the way. Every module takes a ship, you put that ship on that card and you trigger some sort of bonus. So it's this dual system of getting ships out, activating actions, pulling them all back to activate modules. The twist kind of being that if these ships get destroyed in combat, you can't return them to activate your modules. So there's a little bit of like an incentive to make sure that they're not just dying for nothing, that they're kind of being preserved so that you can maximize your engine going, because of getting rewards when you pull them back by putting them out in the space you want to, all that sort of thing. Largely what you're trying to do is build buildings for points, advance up these tracks, which are also multipliers for the points that you're getting for those buildings. So like if I have 3 yellow buildings up, the higher I am on the yellow track, the more each of those yellow buildings is worth, for example. And that's it. It uses the system where once you hit a certain victory point total, then that triggers the end of the game and whoever has the most points wins. I think it's worth jumping into a little bit of a refresher on like my thoughts and dwellings before we go on one.
Yeah, because let me say, because I think it's partially my fault, because whenever I hear a game that is blank of blank, for some reason they all get jumbled in my head. And for some other reason, I default to thinking that there's some sort of legacy campaign game. So when you brought up Dwellings of Eldervale, for some reason I thought it was a campaign game.
It is. But very much not. No.
Okay, because this sounds like to quote Nealon, a Euro-ass Euro, by the way you're
kind of
describing
is. In fact, well, I mean, not really. Like, I wouldn't say that.
Well, I'm hearing tracks, I'm hearing buildings, I'm hearing points. So that's
so there is a lot of that. I will say that like I do think the design intent of both of these is taking what would otherwise be a quite Ameritrashy game and Eurofying it to some extent.
Okay.
You know, like this is ultimately a victory point game that has some elements of engine building to it and worker placement, like pretty Euro so far. But you layer on top of that just kind of like the silliness of like combat interfering with plans, and that a lot of that sort of feels very, very swingy a lot of the time. It's dice heavy combat. It's combat where you have cards that have sort of a lot of big effects, all that sort of thing. So it does a really good job, I would say, of like actually being a good hybrid of very Ameritrashy systems and Euro systems, but the net result being a game that ultimately I don't really feel that strongly about. Like, that was kind of my take on Dwellings of Eldervale. The thing that intrigued me about Andromeda's Edge was this attempt to go further into the Euro directions. Like, that was kind of the selling point of Andromeda's Edge. Like, hey, we're going to sort of take the Euro systems and build them out further, because that's how you appeal to me. Like, you sort of say, like, hey, we're going to sort of minimize the Ameritrash systems, go more toward Euro. And the ways that they do that are definitely, I would say, quite pronounced. Like, they've done the thing that, like, Gaia Project did versus Terra Mystica, where instead of the tracks just being, like, arbitrary tracks, they're kind of more like tech tracks now. So you kind of think, okay, if I'm going to go up the green track, I'm getting a certain type of reward. If I go up the red track, I'm getting a certain type of reward that rewards, like, say, combat or something like that, So there are 5 different tracks, and they're all tied to different techs. Okay, so that's the first major thing. They've done a little bit to like sort of iron out the way the dice combat works, where there's a sort of a minimum threshold based on the number of ships you have. So that if you have like, say, 2 ships in the combat, then you can only roll a minimum value of, I think it's 2 or 3, I forget, like either 1 or more above or the same number, which kind of basically effectively amounts to like re-rolls when you roll badly, So that's one way to sort of like reduce the swinginess of the combat. But overall, I would say that you still have the main problem of, this is a game that has Euro trappings, get resources, worker placement, build up an engine, use all that stuff that you require early to get like points later on, all that sort of thing. That is still mired by some of the silliest combat I've ever seen in one of these sorts of games. Stuff that just kind of feels like very arbitrary and kind of very like janky from time to time. There are still these tactics cards which replace the magic cards, which have like wild swingy effects. Like, one of them is literally actually the combat ends without proceeding, right? So you have a game where the core tension to me is, do I go to this spot knowing I'm about to risk combat? Can I defend that position so that to set up subsequent turns? And if you have like, 1 or 2 of these just nullify combat cards, the whole system is just like completely negated. So it's very bizarre that even exists. Some of the cards are like the polar opposite of that, which is basically like add a 6 to your combat situation, which effectively means you often like instant win. It's just really, really weird to me. Like, I don't quite get the popularity of either of these games. I know that that's obviously something that's super specific to my, and I would say by some extension our, as a podcast's collective tastes, but it's such a weird mishmash of styles of games that I just don't think gels for me. And if anything, the way that Andromeda's Edge steers more down those Euro ways makes like the juxtaposition with like the very Ameritrashy side make the whole feel kind of worse, you know?
Yeah.
But it's like, it's almost like it's now pretending to be more of a Euro game, but there's still like this big glaring problem with the Ameritrashy elements. And on top of that, you kind of just add like a whole lot of rules complexity versus Dwelling. So the one thing I was interested, like going back and listening to my review of Dwellings, was I kind of said at the end, like, I really wish that you took the core of the system and just made it simpler. And they just went like in the opposite direction with it. So it's just, honestly, I hate to say it, but it almost feels like a worse game than Dwellings to me in a way that surprised me, because it should have been one that was like a surefire improvement based on what the intent was, you know?
I mean, you earlier said that you wonder why so many people like it, or why it seems to be getting such positive reviews. I didn't really know much about this game. Obviously, I've already shown that I didn't really remember Dwellings of Eldervale very well. But I will say that I suspect one of the big reasons that it's getting positive reviews is it is quite blingy. It is quite a production. The production is Kickstarter lavish, and I think those games generally are met with enthusiastic reviews initially, at least.
Absolutely. And I think that like it's worth saying that the production values for this are impressive. It is a game that, you know, even when I look at the photos I took of the session I played of it, I look at those and just go, wow, this is kind of really a stunning game. Like it's, you know, it's a little bit garish, but like it's less garish, I would say, than Dwellings was. It kind of feels a little bit more cohesive as a visual production. The miniatures are incredible in it. If I could speak to a couple of points in that like really are the opposite of that, I would say that this does not set up or tear down particularly well. The way that everything goes back into the box is a nightmare. It takes a criminal amount of table space in a way that just feels like absurd to me. So I don't know. It's just, it's too big. It's too much. And it doesn't seem to have really solved any of the big problems I had with Dwellings.
Why are you taking pictures of this game, and where are you sending these pictures?
It's just for my personal collection.
Just for your private personal use?
Yeah, exactly. For my private viewing later, Mark. They're tasteful pictures. How dare you suggest otherwise?
Like modesty bars where needed.
Yeah, exactly.
How long are we talking about this game taking, like, including setup and teardown and all that? Like, is this like a 3-hour thing? Or
oh my god, including setup, teardown, and rules teaching. I mean, I would actually say like setup, teardown, and rules teaching is probably like 2 hours. Like, you know.
Oh wow.
Well, because it's probably like half an hour to set up, like 45 minutes to explain the rules, and half an hour to tear down. You know, so like it's a chunk of time.
Right.
Maybe I'm exaggerating that a little bit, but that's what it felt like, certainly.
Yeah.
And then the game itself is like, you know, two-ish hours probably. I think, two-ish probably hours, 2 to 3 hours maybe. So, you know, it's a beast. It's certainly a beast. And you know, I'm not immune to the charms of games like this with this much sprawl. Like, I mean, that's actually something we'll probably come back to later in the episode, but this one just wasn't it for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is Andromeda's Edge by Cardboard Alchemy.
All right. I'm pretty sure I picked up Karvi, designed by Torgeir Jong and published by Hansum Gluck, in a trade some time ago. I think I traded for it, seeing that it was relatively new at the time and relatively highly rated.
Okay, really quickly. Karvi?
Yes.
How is
Karvi.
it being spelled?
It's being spelled, I might be mispronouncing it, I will say that in advance, but it's spelled Karvi. So what other...
Oh, okay. So kind of almost like Nordic-y, probably?
Yes, very much Viking.
Oh, yeah, lead your Viking crew.
Absolutely.
Okay, sure.
Nice linguistic guess on your part, by the way. I appreciate
I feel like, KAR is one of those things you don't see in a lot of languages.
Anyhow, so I picked it up in a trade. Saw it was relatively new when I traded for it, and I saw the ratings were pretty high. I didn't really know much more about it, but that was enough for me to trade for it. But after setting it aside, there wasn't really anything about the box. It's pretty stark white, save for a nice, if unremarkable, image of a ship on front. Or the title, as Neelan has sort of mentioned, like what even is a Karvi? So nothing got me too eager to crack it back open. In fact, I honestly knew pretty much nothing about it until I saw it pop up recently on BGA, Board Game Arena, and decided that was maybe a sign for me to get it finally to the table. I'll start my review by revealing that Karvi, which we've said already way too many times, is a type of ship that was used by Viking sailors. These ships feature prominently in the game, and in Karvi, you're going to be sailing those ships around using trade and combat, albeit very Eurofied combat, to make yourself the greatest Jarl, I think, around. I think they'll be the leader of a Viking clan. Anyhow, so as I mentioned, I was very late getting to this game, despite the fact that I'd had it sitting there for a while. But I really wish I'd known more about at least its central mechanism, because it is one of my absolute favorites in board games. It has the time track. Fans of Francis Drake or Paris or Glenn Moore or even Nova Luna will be familiar with this. The idea is that you're on a track with a bunch of action spaces. You're allowed to go as far as you want down the track and grab whatever action you want. But if you go really far down, you're going to need to wait for everybody else to catch up and take presumably a bunch of turns in the meantime. It's do I want to make sure to get exactly what I need at the risk of giving everyone else a bunch of extra actions consideration. And I love that. The twist with Karvi is that in addition to how far down the track a space is, there's another cost involved when it comes to considering an action space, and that is the action point cost, or to use the parlance of Karvi, the amount of beer you need to spend to take an action. This beer is represented by pips on your dice that you're going to use as your workers on the time track. So your die, for example, might have 4 beer pips, as they're called. And if you want to take the trade action, for example, in addition to moving your dice down the time track, you're also going to need to spend however many action points that space says you need to spend, and then you spin down your die appropriately. So if my die has, as I mentioned, like 4 beer and the trade space I want to cost 2, I move my die there down the time track, and then I change the die from 4 to 2 and take my action. So as you're moving down the track, you're considering how far you want to move, but also the amount of action points that you spend to take those actions. That die that I just placed would only be reactivated when it was the furthest one in turn order. So again, you go as far as you want, but you only reactivate that die when you're last in line, considering your dice and your opponent's dice. So let's talk about what you're actually doing during the course of taking these actions. There's a lot, but it primarily comes down to 2 general ways you're going to be gaining resources and victory points. And those ways are trading and raiding. Actually, before I get into that, let's talk about another fundamental aspect of the game, which is moving your cute 3-dimensional ship around the map. You do this primarily to pick up 2 types of, I guess, tasks, you might call them, either trading tiles or raiding tiles. The trading tiles are simple enough. They're going to require some combination of the 2 currencies in the game, furs or shields, to fulfill, and then you're going to get a reward. That's basically what trading is. You go around, you pick up these tiles, and it tells you what you need, and you just exchange. The other tiles, the raiding tiles, is where this Eurofied combat that I mentioned earlier comes into play. It'll have some amount of combat strength you need to achieve the task, represented by these warrior tiles that you're going to pick up through the course of the game and increase the strength of throughout the game. If you have enough points of combat, you win. If not, you don't even lose. You just wait until you have enough combat points and then you win. So very, very Eurofied combat. Just, meet the threshold and you win. There's a lot more going on, obviously. In addition to the furs and shields currencies, there are the economies of getting more pips, aka beer, on your dice, and getting more provisions on your boat. And provisions are these little discs that you actually are going to be placing on your boat, and they are the points that you need to spend for every point of movement that your boat takes. A number of different puzzles going on simultaneously. There are also a number of specific endgame goals that you're going to be choosing from and going for through the course of the game. Again, a lot going on. As I think I've alluded to recently, I've felt myself moving away from the sort of midweight Euro recently. Karvi, I would say, though, is an exception. It's not even confrontational in the way that I often like in midweight Euros, that often is like a saving grace for me with midweight Euros. I just really, really love the time track part of it. I think it presents a lot of interesting decisions, and I think the Euro-y parts of the game are done probably as a result of the time track being that central engine of the game in a unique way. Maybe in the end it's window dressing and it's actually just another Euro game doing the same things with another coat of paint, but I really, really don't feel like that's the case. I have, and this is not very typical of me with Euro games, but I found myself really wanting to play this game more and more. And so I was, as I mentioned earlier, very happy to find this on Board Game Arena, and I would wholeheartedly recommend checking it out there at the very least. Though the production quality of the published version of the in real life version is very nice, with again the little boats and the very pretty vibrant presentation. So an increasingly rare but fully throated recommendation for this Euro, Karvi, again designed by Torgeir Jong and published by Hans im Gluck. And I think De Veer is publishing it as well now. So big fan of Karvi.
Yeah, that's cool. Like, from looking at the page, I think the things that like jump out at me that surprise me a little bit is I look at a runtime of like 2 hours minimum and, you know, a sort of medium heavy game. But all of that sort of sinks away when I look at like how lovely the presentation is. It's just got a very inviting look to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I like games that are bright, that have like, color and are just vibrant.
And also very obviously transporting you to like such a very specific thing. It's very clear how big of a component the sailing ships around these islands is in this game. Like, that's what dominates like all of the board space. So that's cool.
Absolutely. And again, like, you know, if you're a fan of time track games that have that system, I think this is like an obvious, definite try at the very least. But again, I've grown a little wary of maybe pointility Euros or non-confrontational Euros. But I'm willing to forgive even that if the Euroing is done in a unique way or, you know, like a fresh way. And again, the freshness might be like as a result of the time track, but even the way it does other things feels like different, feels like it makes my brain think in a different sort of way. So I appreciate that without being too difficult to get into or explain. The action spaces you're going on really fall into like 4 or 5 different kinds, so it's not like you have to consider like a lot of things or remember a lot of different like rules. So simple, but you know, makes you consider these puzzles that are, a number of them are going on simultaneously, but also I think make you consider them in a way that you don't often do in other Euro games. So just a sort of breath of fresh air, I guess, in the Euro space for me.
Cool.
Before we move on, just a couple things here for the middle. We haven't mentioned, I think, in a little while, boardgamebarrage.com/map, where you can go. If you're looking for gaming partners in your neck of the woods, we have many, many places, not only in the U.S., but around the world represented. So if you're looking for somebody to game with, you can go there, put in some information about where you are. You don't have to get very specific, but you can find any barragers in your neck of the woods that you could potentially play games with. As mentioned earlier, if you have topics that you'd like us to talk about, you can go to boardgamebarrage.com/topics and suggest ideas there. We're always happy to have those. You can also suggest topics at boardgamebarrage.com/discord in our feedback channel, where we have people giving us feedback in terms of like things they want to hear us talk about, or just, you know, about the show. We're always happy to hear that. In addition, we have a ton of other channels there at the Discord, and that is always a fantastic resource for me throughout my day. Like, you know, once you get done checking whatever social media that you normally check or reading the news or whatever, I always find our Discord to be sort of a breath of fresh air, not only for talking about games, but, you know, there's been a lot of talk about Hades Town, Kellen's much loved musical, and we know we have a sports channel has been going wild recently with the World Series. So there's a lot of stuff going on there if you are looking to talk to other people about not only board games, but just, you know, stuff in general in life. So a big recommendation for our Discord at boardgamebarrage.com/discord.
And while it's too late to register, unfortunately, but by the time this episode goes out, Ghost Turkey will be kicking off. And I will say, even just from like an outsider perspective, it's such a lovely thing to watch happen, like as people like receive their gifts. So even if you're not taking part, I'd encourage you to check it out, and hopefully that would encourage you to take part next year.
Yeah, that is in the Discord again under the Ghost Turkey channel. So yeah, that is always a thrill to see people opening their Ghost Turkey gifts. So that's very cool. All right, let's go to our feature topic again, generously contributed by Gobbled Goop, something like that.
Bled Goop.
Go Bled Goop. That sounds macabre. Anyhow, so the question again was, what are your exceptions that prove the rule? Basically, games that you should not like, that don't fit into, you know, the type of game that you generally enjoy, but for whatever reason work for you. Before we move on, I know what the phrase, the exception that proves a rule, is getting at. Like, I understand what it's saying, but when I break down that saying, it doesn't make sense to me. The exception.
No, I mean, I think it very deliberately doesn't make sense. It's always, well, I think so, at least. Like, I think it's one of those things that's always bugged me for the same reason, which is to say that, like, yeah, it by definition doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I don't understand how a single exception or a minority exception proves a rule.
I think it's one of those, like, I mean, my understanding at least, it's like, it's just a cutesy saying that allows people to be hypocritical for a second. but I don't know.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's what it comes down to. Okay, and again, Gobbled Goop mentions that they're not big fans necessarily of non-confrontational Euros, but they find themselves enjoying Cascadia with friends. Neil, did anything pop out to you when it comes to this question?
Yeah, there's definitely one, I think, prototypic example for me, which is that I feel like I say this, maybe I don't say it that much on the podcast, but like, because I tend not to gravitate to a lot of them, but games that effectively just boil down to being like massive card tableau games where you have a bunch of cards, each card has a bunch of rules text, you're just building up this sort of huge swath of just cards in front of you, and like every card triggers off other cards, so you have to like know the content of all your other cards to know exactly what your tableau does and how it works and all of that, and the entire game revolves around acquiring cards for this tableau. For whatever reason, I don't gravitate to games like that. I know like Race for the Galaxy, for example, is like the prototypical example of a game that I just, for whatever reason, have bounced off entirely. But then Through the Ages is my favorite game. So I don't know how to like pin those two things together in my head. It's just exceedingly rare. And Through the Ages is maybe the only example I'm aware of where a game has sort of broken through that barrier. Because most of the time, I remember thinking the same thing about like Newsfjord, for example. I just bounce off of like kind of the weight of like going through a bunch of card text. Like that's just not something I generally find appealing in games. One minor exception to this, I would say, is like deck construction games, because a lot of the time that mental load is offloaded outside of the game. So like you know the content of your deck as you're building the deck rather than when you're like playing the game. It's specifically having to absorb a bunch of card text in the middle of playing a game that I usually find very unappealing.
So, two comments to this. Would the Terraforming Mars Earth type of games fall under this for you?
100%. 100%. Like okay. I very quickly get to a point in Terraforming Mars where as I get my new hand of cards, I'm just like, I don't care. Like, I don't care. Like, I don't care to read all of these cards. Like, the idea that I would parse like all 70 of these cards and choose however many to pick, like, it just becomes so rapidly uninteresting to me. I think Ark Nova, like, very smartly skirts this by the way that the card acquisition works in that, which is to say that at any given time there are 5 cards out and you have ample time to absorb their content,
how it
as
works
it were.
for you.
Yeah,
because that was exactly what I was going to get to, because I feel the same way generally about games like that, and Ark Nova is the exception, and yet I couldn't really articulate why until you said that, because I think that's what it is. Like, instead of like a random draw and you're trying to sort of sifting through or figuring it out, there is a like building up of, okay, this is a card I'm going for, I need to grab it right now because it synergizes with what I'm doing, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Aspect planning.
In some ways, I would say that like even specifically the thing that I usually rally against is like here's the hand of cards, or here's the array of cards, and sort of, you know, try to find the best ones in that, because Race has that, right? You do the exploration action, you're suddenly looking at 5 cards, you're picking cards there. Like, that always breaks down for me. I remember the biggest issue I had with Expeditions, for example, which, you know, is a spiritual successor to Scythe. It was kind of exactly that. Like, I got very bored with parsing all of the cards available at any given time. What Through the Ages and Ark Nova, I think, do quite smartly is the way that the card row works in Through the Ages is kind of like a work of genius to me. Like, even though it's a very simple system, it's effectively just a pricing board that sort of moves left, almost like any other card array. But it never feels like the cards to the very right of the array are like entirely unattainable. And because there's like generally a very narrow sort of spread of cards and they sort of gradually move over time, you kind of get the sense that you can sort of absorb what their effects are fairly quickly. I will say the thing that also plays to like Through the Ages advantage is you're going to see all the same cards every single game. So after like a couple of games of playing it, you've seen all the variants that all the cards like could present to you.
And I think that's why I don't have a problem with it in Race for the Galaxy, because by now I've seen like every card in Race for the Galaxy, and I can parse it really, really quickly, and there's not like a lot of mental load from card to card sort of situation. I will say, while we're on this though, this brings something to mind that I hadn't thought of, but when it comes to Euro games, if I'm playing a Euro game where there is a lot of like rules on the card, or like there's a lot of data on the card, that really, really, really turns me off, because I feel like I don't know what my opponent can do, and I feel bad that my opponent doesn't know what I can do because there's all this text on the card. That's one of the problems I had with like Imperial Settlers. All these powers and stuff like written on these cards, and it just like, can you remind me, or what was the game that we played that was like notorious? The one that we played,
Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea. Is that the one you mean?
Yeah, that was like a huge issue I had. It doesn't have cards in that case, but everybody had their own tableau, and it's like, okay, before we do combat, can you remind me all the modifiers you have? And, so I really, really have a problem with like games that are designed that way in general.
Yeah.
And yet, some of my favorite games are the whole coin system of games and all these games where like every single card is like a super exception and has a ton loaded onto each card. And I think for me, the reason why I don't mind it so much in those games is just because they're based on historical things for the most part, and I give them a pass. But I will even admit that like I generally like playing those games either with people who know the cards well, because it just feels like we don't have to have those discussions like, can you remind me what this card does? Can you remind me what you can do? There's less of that, and it feels more fair because of that. Or alternatively, I like playing those games nowadays more solo, because then it's just sort of me versus the game. There's just something that feels bad in me where like when a game is not evenly matched because either one person happens to know the cards better, or if we're both playing a game for the first time or relatively new, it's like, can you remind me what this card does? Can you remind me what your cards do? And it just feels, it's like maybe like sort of along the lines of like when games are like super asymmetrical to the extent where people are playing like different games. It's like, can you remind me what your whole system is? That is just generally a turnoff. But the exception for me is the coin games. But even that exception is now almost limited. I generally don't like games that rely too much on their narrative. For example, like John Company, I haven't even played the second edition of it, but the need for a narrative, like in the first edition, was something that turned me off, and then hearing that it was a big part of the second edition made me not really super eager to get into it. That also was an issue for me with, like, not to pick on Cole Worley too much, but like Oath. Just games that rely on the narrative generally aren't like a huge draw to me. They need to be like structurally a game that I'm interested in order to get me interested. And yet, the exception to this is Stationfall. Stationfall is a game where I'm generally a guy who's like very much driven by like winning the competition of the game. And it's not that I don't care if I win in Stationfall, but the narrative of it is like a huge part of it. And I don't know why. I don't know why I get such a kick out of the narrative of Stationfall. I think part of it is the mechanics, the idea that you have two crew members and you picking the one that you want to go with, and the fact that the crew members all have these interesting powers and different scoring, and like the hidden part of it, the hidden trying to score without your opponents knowing. So like the mechanisms I think are sound and strong and interesting, but I can't help but also get swept up in like the wild narrative that emerges whenever I've played Stationfall. I'll never forget like the first time we played it at my place, and like you taught the game and you taught us that we could do this, but when I actually executed in the game, it still gave me a thrill, and that was like being able to like jump out of the back of the spaceship and like come back around in the front. Just for some reason, I felt like a dynamism when that action occurred, even though it was like akin to like moving from one point to another on a map. But it just felt like part of this space action comedy like narrative, and I just loved it. And I get a lot of those moments from Stationfall, and it's like such a fundamental reason why I enjoy the game so much.
I think if I can like suggest as to like why it works for me in Stationfall, or why it might work for you in Stationfall, is like kind of exactly that. Is it's the fact that story, you know, like the story that the game is telling, that is like obviously being like entirely mandated by the players, evolves so quickly and changes so rapidly based on like the actions that people are taking. Like you might be going down one path like one turn, and then it completely changes into, okay, now we're just dealing with the spaceship exploding, I suppose. And like that, you know, it has these very rapid, complete about turns that just feel like really, really funny to me. It's funny, I actually have Stationfall on my list for like a related but different reason, which is to say that specific thing of like a game that dramatically pivots from turn to turn to turn, like extremely tactical games where you almost may as well like not start thinking about your turn until you've seen what the previous player does, because it could be completely different in terms of board state and what your goals even are and what you're capable of doing. That is usually something I don't like at all, but in Stationfall it works for me, precisely because of like how crazy the story it's telling sort of is, you know, like how wild like the shenanigans seem from like round to round.
That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
To pivot to like a different one entirely, I know that it's also very common to like, you know, harp on roll to move and that style of game. And, you know, we've in the past mentioned how Formula D is a good example of one. But like another one I want to call out is Thunder Road Vendetta, which is otherwise a very sort of straightforward roll to move, take that type nonsense game that I door. I don't know that I like any other games like in this genre at all, but Thunder Road Vendetta somehow just sort of like elevates itself above it. And I can't even like pinpoint exactly why. There's something that is just kind of a little bit novel and a little bit twisty about the way it's implementing its move mechanics, but the way that it just kind of feels like so off the wall, nonsensical from turn to turn to turn. Like, it is just literally a game where if you wanted to, everyone could just gang up on one player and eliminate that player within the first couple of rounds. Like, that's the sort of game we're talking about. Like, that's the level of absurdity. But somehow it just works for me. It's just so sort of completely off the wall insane that I kind of dig it.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I haven't had a chance to play Thunder Road Vendetta too often, but it was a game where I was apprehensive to try. I didn't think I would like it. I heard a lot of good things about it, and Restoration Games generally does well with these old properties that they're redoing. But even then, like, I was really excited about Fireball Island, and then it sort of fell flat, so I didn't really have too high expectations. But I think the way that Thunder Road Vendetta is done is just like perfect. It's like silly but easy to play, and has like these big moments, and yeah, it's done very, very well. I completely agree. For my last one, I'm going to sort of flip this question on its head. I'm going to talk about a game, or actually a series of games, that I should like based on everything that makes them up, but yet for some reason this is a set of games that I just can't get myself into. And this is like the Terra Mystica, Gaia Project, those games. Like, I like puzzle Euros that have interaction to them, and I don't shy away from generally like heavy games, but for some reason I just cannot get myself into these games where everything indicates that I should like them. Like, I've talked a little bit about like how I don't like games that are like crazy asymmetrical, but that's not the case with Terra Mystica and Gaia Project. Like, it's asymmetric in a way that once you've declared what power you have, it's pretty easy to remember. It doesn't make the game completely difficult to understand. So everything about it makes for a game that I should really like. But for whatever reason, I just cannot get myself to get into it. I know that I should like these games. I'm so sure of it. I'm so confident in that I've added Gaia Project to my 10 by 10 at the beginning of the year. Like, I said to myself, like, you're finally going to sit down and you're going to play this game 10 times and you're going to enjoy it. And maybe just the repetition of playing the game will get you to finally realize that it's a game for you. And I just cannot, of my 10 for 10 games, this is like by far going to be the most difficult one for me to get through. So I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, I just cannot get into Terra Mystica or Gaia Project. And that sort of bums me out because I'm excited for some of the newer editions of it, but it just does not seem to be working for me. So let us know if you have similar exceptions that prove the rule for you, games that you shouldn't like because of the way that they're designed, but for whatever reason they work for you. I'd be really interested to hear if there are games that fit this bill, because I think they're indicative of games that break the mold for one reason or another, or that are so good that despite what might be perceived as failings, people still enjoy them. And I think like games that would like qualify as like diamonds in the rough might fall under this. So I'd be interested to hear people who have games that fit this bill, and you can share those games with us at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. And go to our podcast channel where we talk about that week's episode. You can contact us through all forms of social media. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. Again, go to boardgamebarrage.com/map to find other BGBers in the area. Go to boardgamebarrage.com/topics to suggest topics for shows in the future. And a big thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next time, when I guess maybe BarrageCon will have already occurred and all three of us will be talking about playing in person. That'll be fun. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Rolling down Imperial Highway, the big nasty lady at my side, Santa Ana winds blowing hot from the north. We were born to ride.